Okay, look, welcome everyone to this event, Virtual Cities versus Real Worlds. It's organized by the Future Cities Project. I'm Austin Williams, I'm the director, and it's in association with the Academy of Ideas and Zaha Hadid Architects, and I want to thank them and all of our speakers for their support. Secondly, just while I'm on, just to make you aware of these little pamphlets by the Academy of Ideas, letters on liberty, not least because I'm doing the next one, but some information will be posted in the chat room if you want to find out more about it. And finally, if you enjoy the discussion, or even if you don't enjoy the discussion, if you want to make a donation to the Future Cities Project, please make it as large as possible. No, we'll be very grateful for anything that you might give. And my colleague Rob Lyons, you might see in the corner, is co-hosting. In case I drop out, signal goes, then he'll jump in. Okay, so it's 7 o'clock here. It's 2 p.m. in Pennsylvania. Other time zones are available for our international audience. And I think that's one of the things which kind of spurred this conversation. Is it's one of the great revelations of the pandemic, if there is a positive to it, that there's a recognition that you don't have to get on a train or a plane to communicate constructively with other people. But that said, I work in academia, as do a few people here, and in some ways the lack of face-to-face interactions is undermining a little bit, I think, the university experience, which is as much about the university bar and informality as it is about classrooms. So there's good and bad points. We want to try and draw out some of those things. So I'm very grateful to those of you already who are sitting here with your cameras turned on, because that certainly is a help. So just to say, the computer revolution has been talked about for quite a long time, and 40 years ago, it's exactly 40 years ago, when Alvin Toffler brought out the third wave, speaking about the electronic cottage, where information technology would empower people to live in the countryside while simultaneously working for the city. And it's been a bit of a romantic ideal for a long, long time. 120 years ago, when the Garden City movement was meant to be a happy mix of the town and the country, Ebenezer Howard. And then you find out that the reality was a little bit different. Stephen Graham and Manuel Castells back in the 1990s were pointing out that actually, as mobile technology and internet communication increased, instead of reducing the need for face-to-face contacts, it actually increased them. People were organizing via email to meet up, and it gave rise to the growth of coffee shops and cafes and the like. So some of the questions we want to try and address are those: has the digital city finally arrived? Is the virtual merely a retreat from the real? Could we or should we go back to business as usual? And will urban centers survive this online revolution? And that's kind of a very rough framing. So there's lots more to talk about, from science fiction to online gaming, video games, and what have you. But we've got a very good panel, which I will introduce to you now in order in which they will speak. And then, like I say, at the end, we'll come out to the audience. So first up, we have Maria N. Mcdonald, Executive Director at the Center for the Living City in Pennsylvania. She's a practicing interior architect and Program Director of Interior Architecture at Mary Wood University in Scranton, Pennsylvania, where she's speaking from, where she's a founding faculty member of the University School of Architecture. She specializes in adaptive reuse, preservation, and restoration projects, and the center builds on Jane Jacobs' legacy, which I think has got a lot of purchase for this conversation. Second up, we'll have Patrick Schumacher, principal architect at Zaha Hadid Architects. He's described in his Twitter handle as an architect promoting parametricism and economic freedom. He's a writer and theorist, as well as one of the world's leading practitioners. And in 2008, he coined the phrase parametricism, and he's been banging on about it ever since. As an aside, when we were setting up this debate, Patrick invited me to have a chat with him about it, and I dutifully traveled all the way across London, only to find out that I was in his office video conferencing him as he sat on his sofa in his house. So even that idea about meeting up, the phrase kind of is losing its meaning somewhat. Then we have Julie Alexander, Director of Technology and Innovation at Places for People, which is an umbrella regeneration company where her role is to drive innovation across placemaking activities and placemaking activities of the organization. But she's also a member of Smart London Board and is chair of the managing board of UK Collaboratorium for Research in Infrastructure and Cities. This is all easy for you to say, which aims to create a world-class national infrastructure capability combining physical and social sciences. And then finally, we have Alistair Donald, Associate Director at the Academy of Ideas, where he coordinates projects such as the Battle of Ideas Festival, and he's the co-founder of the Residential Living Freedom School for 18 to 25-year-olds exploring the meaning and ideals of freedom. He was previously the architecture program manager for the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, and he's worked in urban design, planning and regeneration and advising on urban policy at the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister. So that was it. That was quite a rapid fire introduction, I'm afraid, trying to get rid of me and onto the speakers. I've asked each speaker to speak for just maybe 6 or 7 minutes, and I'll have to be quite tight. And then once we've heard in turn, I'll ask a few general questions if we have time, and then it'd be out to you, the audience, for questions and comments. So there you go. I'm exhausted already. Maria, over to you in Pennsylvania. Welcome.
Hello, thank you. Okay, I'm going to share my screen with you. And I'm also going to share with you the last year of my life in 6 minutes. And I'm coming to you from Scranton, Pennsylvania, in the northern eastern section of Pennsylvania. We're about 2 hours from New York City, 2 hours from Philadelphia. And a year ago, almost this week, I applied to be the new executive director for the, so this is the part of my application to be the new executive director of the Center for the Living City. Prior to that, I had a very nice quiet life as an architect and practicing a professor of architecture here in Scranton. So the director notified me that there was a change in leadership, and I thought, okay, well, give it a try. The Center for the Living City holds the singular distinction of being the only urbanist organization founded in collaboration with Jane Jacobs. So I thought, why me? Why Scranton? Why not? Scranton, Pennsylvania is a very real city, and it also happens to be the home of Jane Jacobs. So Jane Jacobs grew up here. We are a medium-sized Rust Belt city, which has fallen on very hard times. Coal mining was our primary industry, and it was gone into disrepair, and we've been scrapping and trying to come back ever since the bust. So in this city, we regularly participate in neighborhood as well as citywide activities, strong sense of community, social responsibility, and civic pride. So this is my case to the Center for the Living City, why I should be the next executive director. I pleaded that Scranton, Pennsylvania sits happily within all of these Rust Belt US medium-sized cities with our population of 77,000. I also demonstrated how Scranton competes with New York City, and our population is quite a bit smaller, and our average income is quite a bit smaller, but there's a phenomenon here where you grow up in Scranton and you head to New York. So here I am making my plea, showing in real time how we work with strings to actually interconnect our community. We canvass neighborhoods, we create war rooms, we go through old maps, and we even branded ourselves with a logo to prove how great we are as a city coming back from decline. And this is some of the data. And then we go out into the community and we spend a lot of time engaging with people. We talk with runners and bikers and try to convince everyone that Scranton is the greatest place to live in the US. And we're learning our lessons from the past, taking our cues from Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs walks happen quite often around the United States and the world. So I have a few images of our walks. We walk and talk about Jane's first city, her home, where she grew up, the values that were instilled in her living here in Scranton. We host events throughout the city. We make the case that old places matter, that they're important. We pack them in every empty storefront we could find. We would have events and host as many people in person to show our work, to show the value of a medium-sized city coming back. Scranton is known as the Electric City, and I made the case that it sits in a valley, again, of a coal mining city and northeastern Pennsylvania in the Northern Hemisphere, and we are here. Scranton, in fact, is real, and we are here. And the wonderful people at the Center for the Living City seem to agree and appointed me as the executive director. Woohoo. About a month later, this happened. So everything that I had known prior has now changed. Keep your distance, stay at home, and the world was closed. As quickly as it was opening up for me, it was shut down. So we went under glass, quite literally under glass. We were hosting a big theater event in downtown Scranton, and it went under glass. It went into storefronts. We started to engage with technology in a kind of different way. So these are the participants communicating with the actors under the glass. We'd socially distanced. We listened to music from afar. Our beautiful Jane Jacobs walks now went online. Now they were walks at home. But we got to work. Scranton, Pennsylvania, a very real city, is now a very virtual city. And in life, this blinks. I tried to make this blink on our slideshow, but I wasn't able to do that. But if you were here, you'd see it blinking. We're working from home. We're virtual. And this interesting thing started to happen where we started to get this hybrid, half virtual, half in person. We got creative. We started to get really good at Zooming and really good at, keeping our spirits up, locked away. And then this odd thing started to occur. Working remotely. All of a sudden, Scranton became a really great place to live. The best place to work remotely right now is Scranton. Welcome. Work from here. Looking for to work remotely, come to Scranton. We have amenities. Let's work from here. And it's unbelievable what's starting to happen to our little city. People are flocking to this community in ways that we haven't seen in years. This is amazing. This screenshot is absolutely accidental. New life for old Scranton buildings. Coincidentally, look what's rolling across the bottom of the television screen. New cases of COVID bringing the total. People have died. I mean, it's awful, but at the same time, it's this phenomena that's happening to our city. And I just felt like it was time to share. I mean, for this talk, when the opportunity came, I wanted to share that with everyone, what's happening. So here we're starting to regenerate, innovate, prosper, and create. There's a surge in people coming back to our area because they can telework. We're selling homes faster than they can go on the market. Our mayor launched a campaign in July, Work From Here initiative, to lure workers to keep their jobs elsewhere, live here. In a matter of months, we've gone from renters to homeowners and landlords. So now we still engage, listen, and learn virtually. We're still mapping, analyzing, connecting virtually. We're traveling, we're seeing the world, and we're observing virtually. We're collaborating virtually. We're building partnerships virtually. We're communicating virtually. Our virtual has met our real in a big way here in our community. We're still here, but now we're interconnected in a different kind of way. It's what's bringing me to you. Let's see what the future holds. Thank you for listening. We are here. Oh, and P.S. Jane Jacobs isn't the only one who grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Someone else did too.
Very good.
Thank you
very much. Thank you very much, Maria. Perfectly timed warning to everyone else. And very interesting. It'd be interesting to see in the conversation as to whether you think anything's been lost in this process, let alone just the gains that you very clearly identified. Anyway, we're moving on. Patrick, please, if you would. You're on mute, Patrick.
So good.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, thanks for hosting this. It's an interesting panel, and just curious what we just heard in terms of the expectation which must be behind these purchases, that this teleworking is semi-permanent, perhaps permanent, and that's what we also feel to some extent, and what we're planning for, and many other companies planning for, a partial return to an office. Is we actually consolidating our places. We're giving up one and keeping another one, so we're reducing. And but at the same time, we are very happy to be in the center of the city of London. And I think that in terms of my experience of living in Hoxton Street and in Shoreditch and so on, that the social interactions have been very, very intense throughout the year, except for the second lockdown where this was shut down. So while people were working from home, they were still out in the bars, clubs, restaurants, cafes, and the shops. So the idea of social gathering was very important, and we kept our offices open for some people to meet. We had an effort, of course, to keep up not the productivity, which was fantastic, client presentations, meetings, delivery of teamwork, that worked all very well remotely, But in terms of the culture, we had to absorb a lot of new people. So we developed mechanisms of online communication, Petra Kutchas every week, for instance, presentations, so we know who we are and what we're doing. So that was an effort. I foresee, there was a question, Austin, that partially there could be a switch in real estate usages, for instance, a place like London away from offices into more residential. There's been too much commuting, actually not enough good mix. And so I think that will be beneficial. Some maybe older generations will move out, like the kind of equivalent of Scranton, and come in once a week, twice a week. And that's doable. So I think the less traffic, and a lot of people would actually enjoy then moving in, and hopefully the market of real estate and reutilization is free enough to make those shifts possible, so that we can have a nice urban experience walking to the office and back. But also the office will change. We are now thinking much more in terms of social spaces, enticing people to come. We do a full revamp of our places with more meeting rooms and social spaces. Now, what I find interesting is at the same time, there's a new opening for architects, and that's what I'm working on. The last few minutes I want to talk about this, which is the developing, first of all, cyberspaces. I think it's happening. So many institutions found it necessary to bring out there, whether it's exhibition or trade fairs or conferences and meetings somehow into the virtual world. And there's a lot of firms out there offering virtual meetings, conferencing spaces. There's, of course, things like VR chat, and some of the games have these socializing hangout spaces like Fortnite. And there is AR overlay kind of firms, so many. And there is these kind of metaverses like Second Life, and now new ones, Decentraland, Somnium Space. So I've been looking at that, and I foresee a technology transfer from these, what have been kind of gaming and entertainment worlds on VR experiences, have developed enough to now kind of migrate into the professional world. And I think in this sense, cyberspace for professional engagement communication is happening, and we are working on that actively with a number of, with an interesting kind of discussion group. One of the authors of this, Daniela Gatovic, is sitting with us here. We want to create a kind of virtual Lieberland. And they need it because the real Lieberland is kind of suspended and bring the various governance structures together in the virtual space, and maybe also being kind of incubator for blockchain companies who want to would have liked to might locate. So that brought up the idea of this kind of what I call a cyber urban incubator, and we're actively working on this with some of our clients. So we have a number of startup colonies and clusters and corporate headquarters, technology centers like Tencent Xi'an, or so-called unicorn Chengdu, unicorn Chongqing. And we approach some of these clients, and we have nearly everything is anyway in fully 3D modeled and in VR experiences, which we've created. We also had in parallel developed a whole kind of occupancy modeling. So we're doing first-person perspective experiences with the space full of simulated people, and the step to simulating avatars and inviting and launching these VR experiences online for end users, for participants, for clients, for marketing and an early use is the kind of idea and agenda. And first client reactions to the idea is very positive. And we have already generated this digital twin of our Beijing office, and we set it up as a virtual engagement space. So we can have a number of small multi-user experiences where you come in and see each other, talk to each other, throw things on the screen. And there are plenty, I mean, this space in terms of offering that up gets a lot of investments. There's a lot of startups crowding in, with, and I think it's exciting. And we architects finally have a new task. I mean, this was the whole of the internet and web experience was graphic designers for the last kind of 25 years. At the beginning of the internet, it was meant to be cyberspace, and I think now it is happening, and we're actively pursuing that. And trying it out, and I'm working on it with AIDRL. I'm working on it with the research groups in our office, and I see others getting into that space. And as I said, we're working on this Lieberland concept. So I think it's an exciting experience and prospect, because I do believe that, and one thing is which is important, it's not a pure cyberspace project, that I'm working actively on how can we use the same kind of 3D model and the same design, the same, let's say, semiological language to develop both the virtual and the real presence, and how we having thinking of spaces where we can overlay both, where we can have windows into the virtual world and we can partially be co-present in real space, and then allow others to join with a more immersive experience rather than a grid of faces and a list, where you have also particular, you can make not only scheduled events, but you can kind of roam around and hang out and approach somebody, and it feels right. And it's, the youth who are on Fortnite, they do this continuously, really continuous social hangout space, and there are quite a few others where you watch movies together in VR. So I think that's a real point, a real possibility. We had, some of our, celebrated a birthday on Mozilla Hubs. There are a lot of those tools, and I think it's time for professional designers with professional agendas, well-resourced clients, to push it to the next level. And we're working also with Epic, the Unreal Engine people, and we're working with Unity. So it's an exciting new research project for Zardid Architects, for the AA, and for many others.
Great. Thank you very much, Patrick. At the end of this, I might ask you whether this is just a luxury for creatives or the service sector that you're talking about, because hanging out in social spaces, I mean, you can't give somebody the bumps on a virtual birthday party, can you? So it's, I just wonder whether there's a split in who's actually benefiting or realizing some of these brilliant ideas, I have to say. But let's come back to that a little bit later. We have Julie, please. You're still mute.
There we go.
There you go.
Took me a while to get the button to click. Thanks so much, Austin, and thanks to Maria, because you've completely sold your city to me. So next time I'm across the water, when we're all out of travel, definitely paying you a visit. Yeah, and interesting as well, listening to Patrick. I mean, I would completely echo the sentiments around London and this need to change the commute, and but retain that sort of social interaction, which I think a lot of people are really missing now. So I work for Places for People, which is a large placemaking organisation. We own and manage 200,000 homes around the UK. Our business is partially social housing provider and partially building to the private market. And my job is really to look into the future and see what risks are coming over the horizon. Now, whilst I didn't predict COVID coming when it did, I was looking at a particular solution for our homes and our customers, which I'll come back to in a second, which, had we had at the time of COVID, would have absolutely transformed our approach to how we engage with our customers. So since joining Places for People 2 years ago, prior to that, I was with Siemens running their Global Smart Cities program. But moving into real estate, I really wanted to come to the customer side, not trying to develop and sell the technology, but actually bring it in, adopt it, deploy it, and see how people engage with it. So I developed our 4 futures strategy. So those 4 futures are net zero carbon, digitalization and construction, IoT and communities, and what I call forever living homes. And all those 4 themes are around those big mega trends: climate change, digitalization, urbanization, and demographic change. So the one that sort of really excites me, which I'll just mention because we only have a few minutes, is this forever living homes idea. 43% of our customers are over 55. And as we know, the world is getting older. And what happens in people's lives? They reach a turning point where vulnerabilities set in, and perhaps they have a trip or a fall. And from that point on, they're on a downward trajectory into supported housing or some kind of care. And my idea really is how can we deploy technologies in our general needs accommodation such that we can support people to stay in their homes for longer, more independent, and feeling safe and secure. So we've got a couple of projects ongoing around that, which has allowed us to engage with some of our customer base, more elderly customers. And we've been doing some really interesting research around what they consider their vulnerabilities to be. with things like trips and falls coming out on top. And just doing the research, I mean, I was quite astounded to see how many people actually die every year just from a trip or a fall. But this idea that mobility declines and a number of things decline with it. So people's diet declines, people's ability to sleep, people's confidence just declines, their ability to look after their partner declines. So many things tied into this sort of aging process. So some of the things that we've been looking at are around, how can people retain their confidence? In housing today, you have the ability to put in sort of pull cords and things, which people really don't. They don't want to believe that they're getting old. They want to feel very independent, and they don't want to feel like an invalid. And also this fear that if they go outside of their home, actually the pull cord just doesn't work. So who's going to find them if they trip on the pathway into the front door? And this concern was really coming through. It was not so much the trip or the fall itself. It's this idea that if something happened to me, who's going to know? So we're looking at different technology solutions. And what struck me from engaging with these customers were that since COVID, actually, all of these factors have declined. So they can't get out so much. They can't have that social integration that they had before with their communities. And actually, although some are still a bit sensitive around the use of technology and feel that they're not tech savvy enough to work with technology, it seems to me that in this day and age of sort of COVID and considering how we interact with people, there's some real interesting solutions out there that we can deploy to really support that demographic. And I think they're too easily forgotten about. And when I think about this technology, I think of anyone over sort of age of even 55, 60, who may for some reason have some health problem or whatever it might be, who can engage. When COVID happened, what we did, we turned our call center, which is the place you call if you need a repair, we turned that into a call out center. We were making about 1,000 calls a day. So it took us a long time to get around all of our customers. Were they okay? Did we need to signpost them? With this technology, we could have done it at the touch of a button, 70,000 people, just effectively like sending an email, because this technology now can help us communicate with our customers and them to communicate with their care workers, the support groups, or even the local community. So I'd really like to see in this world of post-COVID, a real practical application of technology, looking at some real problems that people are experiencing that they always have experienced, but how we can really improve the quality of people's lives through the use of forever living homes type technology that actually goes beyond just their own needs as they age, but actually allows them to become more integrated into society again. So that's a project that's underway at the moment. Really exciting, sort of pairing that up with digital twinning of our stock and such like. So exciting times to come.
Thank you very much indeed, Julie. It's always disconcerting to hear somebody talk about the ailments of the elderly and then realize you're talking about me. But I'll sit up straight. Okay, thank you very much, Julie. That's really, really interesting. And I like that kind of practical, bringing it back to practical. And then we'll finally have Alistair, please. The dreaded unmute.
Is that it? Can you hear me?
You're on. You're on.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Well, I think I'm coming at this from a bit more outside the urban industries, if you like, from compared with the rest of the speakers. And one of the things that strikes me when looking in is that the kind of post-pandemic city seems to often be viewed with quite a sense of fatalistic inevitability. And I don't think that the pandemic need really have any longer term impact. There's no reason why an emergency shutdown need offer any lessons as to how the city should be. It's not to say we should do nothing, but I think the choices that we have are often a lot greater than are portrayed. Likewise, we have a choice about how to use technology. I mean, the outcomes are rarely determined by technology itself as much as the outlook of society, I think. So to take a couple of contrasting examples, of versions of the printing press were available for around 300-400 years before Johannes Gutenberg arrived on the scene, but it took the emerging humanist culture of that interested in cultivating and disseminating knowledge to really kick that technology on. By contrast, today we have the internet and mobile phone technologies that put ideas, information at our fingertips. But a lot of the time, the kind of more therapeutic mood that we have in society means that these technologies tend to feed rather less productive trends towards narcissism and self-absorption. So I think to understand the current appetite for virtual cities and for all things technology or working from home or country living or all the rest of it, we really need to understand the cultural outlook that we inhabit today, including our attitudes, I think, towards real cities. So just to give a couple of examples, which are a bit throwaway, but I think tell us something. Firstly, a little cartoon that caught my eye in The Spectator this week of a man standing outside a travel agent. And he's contemplating his next holiday destination, but he's about to be arrested by an approaching policeman. And what is the offence? Loitering with the intent to travel. Now, it's often claimed that the pandemic, and I think some of our speakers have already claimed really that this pandemic has changed things utterly. But in reality, I think what's happened is that actually it's reinforced some pre-existing trends and perhaps opportunistically really latched on to the pandemic as a means of introducing them. So you've only got to think of long-running environmentalist campaigns, for example, against flying or driving, or the endless local authority travel plans that we've had over the years that prioritize local living locally and walking and cycling. And you know, you can understand that for some time the intent to travel has been viewed quite suspiciously. So for this new idea of the 15-minute city that's now favoured, which is kind of live locally rather than inhabit the sort of wider metropolis of city centres or suburban homes or ex-urban business parks, I think, you know, that the decisions in some ways have already been made before the pandemic, and these localized travel reduction solutions, they're not really post-pandemic solutions, but a problem that I think exists from a longer term lowering of horizons and ambitions towards mobility. Second example is a headline that caught my eye in The Independent, which says, working from home, slipper sales surge in lockdown as Britons seek comfort. And in the past year, apparently, getting comfy at home has become all the rage and the nation's #1 priority. And, you know, obviously I get that being stuck at home for prolonged periods, you're not going to want to wear your kind of knee-length leather boots or whatever. But I do think that we should be a little bit worried about our new comfort with domesticity, or to put the flip side, that we should be concerned about what I think is a bit of an anxiety or a hesitancy over the public side of our existence and getting out there. I don't want to overstate it. I mean, many are keen, obviously, to get back to normal. And you look at something like the announcement of the Reading and Leeds music festivals this week that sent phone lines crashing in a desperate bid to get tickets. And, you know, you sort of cheer at that example, actually, of people wanting to get out. But I do think that there's a significant section of society that have now come to view working in our living room or drinks with friends over Zoom as an acceptable substitute for getting out and about. And I worry about that. It makes me nervous, because some people's nervousness about getting back on the tube or out into the pub, I think has potentially detrimental effects. I can understand it, because the reality is that cities are difficult. They're actually not places of comfort. They're the exact opposite of the home. They're places of discomfort. And impersonal interaction of cities requires quite a complex set of unwritten codes and rules that frame how we live and interact in public, that, you know, there's no doubt that they're demanding. They require some level of continuous engagement and negotiation. They require taking risks, whether it's dealing with unruly kids on a bus or responding to some office bore without getting in trouble from the boss, or meeting a new partner in a nightclub. These, you know, there's a level of difficulty to these things. But I do think that shying away from doing these things is a problem, and not just for us as individuals, but also for the city itself, because, you know, any successful or dynamic city, it seems to me, is one that is to some extent reveling in that push towards a level of discomfort. You know, in other words, cities are places where the demand for activity to work or travel or party or kind of creatively exploit your freedom pushes up against the existing limits, the boundaries of what is possible. And that ultimately is how we and how cities progress. Unless you ask these questions, unless you push at the limits, then you don't really get any answers or new answers. So it's obviously in some ways we've already lost enthusiasm pre-pandemic for some of these fundamental values of successful real cities, as I would say they are. I think in responding to this pandemic, perhaps the most laudable ambition we could have is to kind of restake a claim for some of their benefits.
Very nice. Thank you very much, Alistair. Well, you know, there's a million and one different tones to this conversation, which has just taken place with 4 presentations. I thought it was really interesting, Julie, following on from Patrick. There's Patrick with his goggles, waltzing around the nether regions of the internet, while Julie, you actually wanted to go to Scranton to see it for yourself, which I thought was very funny. And then I come back to Maria asking what's been lost, because you gave a very positive case. I mean, it was a great advert for Scranton, I have to say, better than Biden's done. But what has been lost in this? You know, I mean, and then coming back to Patrick again, there's that idea that there's this wonderful stuff going on in the virtual world, in this kind of virtual reality in some respects. But obviously, sometimes it takes people to build it. You know, even Scranton, building those new houses for the people who are now moving out into those areas from New York City, they need new apartments. Somebody has to build this stuff. There has to be a physical reality which has to be kind of dealt with as well. So, I mean, there's a million and one things going on. Anybody want to pick up on what anybody else has said in this conversation, rather than necessarily address my questions? But there's a lot of really interesting conversations going on here. Anybody want to come in? I think we've got to unmute.
Now we can.
Problem. Yeah, you can. Okay, good. Is that a no?
Well, now I just want to say, just very briefly, I mean, you talked about the about as the VR worlds, and what my project, our project at the moment is to integrate that with real spaces. So that we actually gathering, and sometimes we do have that. I mean, if we talk to our Beijing office, they're all sitting there, and then we have kind of 10 or 15 individually dislocated. And I think the experience in Beijing is probably better. But I want to have that mixed experience where we can, those who want to and need to and enjoy collaborating and in the city, in spaces, and those who are not co-present, and that also opens it up, of course, to many more global co-presence. They can also join in a way which is more immersive and more, let's say, which has also that possibility of networking on the side, the after party, the chat ahead of the actual scheduled event, and just checking in and browsing and hanging out. That's the idea. And this hanging out and being around has been incredibly important for the culture like Zadid Architects in terms of being in the city. I mean, people spending 80% of their salary to be in cycling or walking distance. And, you know, we're working lunches in the office around pub life afterwards, lecture at the AA, at the Bartlett, the teaching, all of that is very important, that networking. And that cannot be sustained at the moment with the kind of digital tools which are not hangout tools. They're mostly scheduled conditions. So the idea is that if that virtual space is also something where you find yourselves with others and those who are actually roaming around in the digital twin in the real space. That's the kind of project, and I do believe, and Alistair's quite right, I believe that in the intensity and urban experience, I think younger people want that still. So what I said earlier was so stunning in terms of the experiences here, where nobody was going to work, but everybody's out, and the pubs were still going. That's a real desire for many. If some want to withdraw into the comfort of their their homes, fine. It might be the slightly older generation, and let them, you know, let them do that, and they still would come in at important occasions, of course.
Tragic.
I think London will be a much younger and more dynamic city. I'm looking forward to that.
The worst thing is, Patrick, I got a terrible feeling that some of the younger generation are more susceptible to hiding away at home than the older generation are. I can't wait to get out. I mean, I just did a tutorial with one of my students, and of course, I was very sympathetic to the fact that it's just a student who's been in lockdown for 12 months. I asked how he was, whether he was stressed or anything. Anyway, he was Zooming me from Barbados, where he'd gone on holiday with his parents. Suddenly kind of turned the tables on me. But at the same time, I've heard lots of cases of people now teleworking from Spain and just beginning to realize that actually maybe we should be employing a Spanish person for 1/3 of the salary than bothering to get an expensive Zaha Hadid worker for an extortionate salary. So, I mean, I think there may be a leveling up in some respects and a leveling down. So there's great opportunities and terrible things happening.
I wonder how employment law will interface with that. We are actually thinking about that. Yeah.
Let's not bring the European Union into this, for God's sake. But it's also the fact that there is a situation in the last 12 months, let's say, and you can criticize me if you think I'm overgeneralizing, but there is a situation where people are a little bit more suspicious of private life or privacy, or what are you hiding in the COVID world. And there's also people are growing more nervous about public life, being seen or being active in crowds, and that is bound to have an equal and opposite or some effect on the way that we understand what urban life is all about. And I just wonder where you think that's going to take us. Does anybody want to pick up on any of these points?
Yeah, I don't mind jumping in. I think I think we're living under very unique conditions at the moment, and we're all getting used to new ways of life. I takes me probably about 50 minutes to commute to the office in central London, the same on the way home. I decided that I wouldn't use that time to work, but I'd go out on my bike and I'd take the dog for a longer walk, and I love that. And that's great. So I do that every day now. Do I want to trade that for going back on the tube? Not every day, but do I want to go back into central London and make use of all the facilities there? Absolutely. So it's about really finding that balance. And I think most people that I know are very similar in their thinking there. Depends what your own life situation is. I mean, people with young families, maybe it suits them better to be closer to schools and not have to rush and get the train and be in on time and all those sorts of things. So I think it'll be horses for courses. But I think, yes, we are a little bit worried about that whole gathering in public spaces thing, but that's because we're being told not to. I think once we move on, and hopefully we will move on to better times, then that need to meet and those kind of great, certainly working in London, every time you go in, something new has popped up, and it's just that kind of the richness that you get from those experiences. I think people will always hanker after that. So I think it will come back, the need to meet one another and go out and enjoy ourselves, because we'll realize that there's so much more to the world if we lock ourselves away at night and just, I don't know, watch Netflix or whatever it is that we do.
That's a fair point. I think there's some architects have the luxury of, no offense, Patrick, but of being paranoid about coronavirus and staying at home while the construction industry gets on and building their buildings. So it's a little also like, we can have a conversation about staying at home, working from home, virtual networking, while there are cleaners and there are certain kind of low-end trades that don't have the luxury of being able to do this. So that split city could also come in a different form, couldn't it? We could have a different level of challenge within the city arising from the necessity of physical face-to-face activity and the luxury of those of us who can stay away. But anyway, Maria, you are keen to come in.
Oh, sure. I was just, thinking about the common thread that binds the four of us, and that is the virtual world and technology, and how interesting it is in a way that it's pushed us all. The pandemic has pushed that forward. It's sort of forced these conversations to the forefront in ways that maybe it wouldn't have. I know in my own teaching, we'd have a speaker, maybe a remote speaker here or there, but now it's opened up our world to our students in a much more dynamic way, and online teaching is much more real, and these kind of conversations that we're having right now are happening much more commonplace. I personally had never heard of the word Zoom, prior to last year at this time. Now I wish I had stock in Zoom, but I mean, it's opened up this, and I mean, I think because of where I am in this kind of a city that struggled so long to try to come back from an identity crisis and from an economic crisis, the idea of this virtual reality now is so exciting. And the possibilities, I think, are so, we will never stop walking our dogs and being out in our coffee shops and go. We are the 15-minute city in real time. We can get everywhere we have to in this city. We can walk every place. But now we have the benefit of listening to Patrick talk about this occupancy modeling. I think it's fascinating. I want to know more about it. I want my students to know about it. And Julie, my God, how wonderful to think about technology to help the people on the decline. Think about what the potential could be to now. Now, would we be having these conversations if COVID didn't happen? I'm not sure in the manner in which we're doing it now with the urgency that we're doing it. So I just think that I'm grateful for this conversation. And I know we're all coming from different perspectives. Alistair, right with you on the concern for getting just a little bit too comfortable at home. But you know, I've made connections with neighbors that I had never talked to, and I've lived in this place for 15 years, and I didn't even know the people across the street, and now we're close friends. So it's forced us into different sort of relationships, I think, with people that may not have happened otherwise. And I think we're going to emerge from this with different kinds of personal connections and relationships with one another in a very profound and very interesting way. That's all I wanted to say. I see how it connects us.
Thanks very much. Eternally positive, Maria. I actually moved to the city so I didn't have to talk to my neighbors. But there you go. That's just me. Alistair.
Yeah, I mean, I recognize what Julie is saying. Is saying, obviously, in terms of the unique conditions. But it just seems to me that there's a tendency to try and normalize these unique conditions. I mean, the phrase of the last year has been the new normal. You know, that's meant to signify that some of the things that have happened over the past year must inevitably lead to a different situation where we have to have a new normal. And it just, I think if you look at some of the things that are talked about as either will happen or are desirable to happen, and obviously quite often they're dressed up as kind of quite sexy technological solutions. So they are online learning. I mean, universities are obsessed by online learning just now, not just in a temporary context, but they see a longer term future for online learning, which when you think what that means, it means that students will not be in a university building, mixing with other people, having informal conversations, discussing ideas, kicking around what it is that they're interested in, why they differ in their opinions from their fellow students. Those things just do not happen in, no matter how sexy it's sold, the online world of Zoom. So I think there's a problem in here that we need to at the very least recognize and think about how it is that we're going to address these things. Because I agree with the comment about actually it's not just older people who are going to be, you know, constrained a little bit more, but this is an impact on younger people as well. The theatre in your television screen in your living room has become to some extent a more desirable thing than going out and mixing with crowds uptown. I mean, I was one of these people who for years looked quite suspiciously on people like Richard Florida with their whole sort of creative cities shtick, which basically said that, you know, you put theatres and you put bars in the centre of towns, and all of a sudden, hey presto, you've got a vibrant city that's a good way of living. Because I thought that actually missed some of the ingredients out that made a city creative and interesting. But these days, you kind of almost want a bit more Richard Florida, someone to actually come out in full-hearted support of gathering together in city centres, no matter what it is that he misses in his analysis. So I just think it's important just now to restake a claim for some of these things that are going a bit missing.
Great. Look, we got some hands showing up, so I'll come out to the audience. More people can stick their hands up. If you click on the participant button, then you should get your...
Can I give some pushback to Alistair first?
Yeah, no, you can come back in a minute. Somebody might reinforce you and help you out. You never know. Hang on a sec. So I've got Paul Reeves and I've got Sarah, but and still they come. Good. So you get your handle on the blue hand. Coming to Paul first, and then Sarah. If you can, yes.
You can hear me, I
Indeed,
assume.
indeed.
Yeah. Originally, I was going to make a point around Julie's point about social interaction, because I get a feeling, really, everyone talks about social interaction, but really a lot of people, the powers that be, are actually talking about what I might term social interaction skepticism. They talk about it a lot, but really they don't want everyone to go to pubs and drive around in their cars and stuff like that. Then I realized this is actually a discussion about cities. So it reminded me a few years ago, the big thing, I work in Cambridge, the big thing was clusters, innovation clusters, which obviously was all predicated on people being close to each other, talking, going to pubs, blah, blah, blah. But obviously now there's more this positivity put around this constraint around sort of virtual working, etc. Now I work in quite a high-tech industry, digital manufacturing, so we have lots of online meetings around whatever the technologies. But I've noticed quite a lot of these discussions, what happens is a lot of IPs involved, intellectual property, non-disclosure agreements and stuff like that. And I think there's a definite, people are limiting themselves about what they're actually talking about compared to, now I was quite skeptical about clusters, but at least about in somewhere like Cambridge, people meeting, they would have a drink, blah, blah, blah. And intellectual property would kind of leak out, you know, you'd go to a bar with a competitor company, you'd be talking a bit about what you're doing. Quite possibly people will actually have ideas because they could be combining these ideas from different companies, and new ideas could actually, you know, be generated. And not only that, people would actually move jobs, you know, because of this freedom, people would actually say, well, actually, that's a bit more interesting. I want to go there as well. So I suppose what I'm saying is, I think there is an obvious, no, not obvious, and not obvious, but quite basic in terms of innovation limitation, which is where maybe I'll push back about a bit about what Patrick's saying about these virtual worlds, because people just aren't free to be normal human beings and do the things that normal human beings do, which is, as I say, the example I give is they leak IP, they do things where in a meeting, their boss is there. They're not going to talk to other colleagues at the same level in other companies at the same level. So to me, it's a fairly obvious, I'm almost beginning to think clustering is a good idea. There's an element to it, real clustering in the real world. You're muted.
Sorry, no wonder you didn't stop talking when I asked you to. So I've got 4 hands. I need to see some more. What I'll do, ladies and gentlemen on the panel, is I'll take these 4 questions. You, please God, don't answer them all in turn. Otherwise, we'll be here all night. So just pick, you know, which bits take your fancy. So next up, we have Sarah.
Hello. So I don't work in architecture at all, but I am a big city fan, and I've spent time in 12 different countries over the past year. And I guess I have like a few observations and also just one question to kind of put to the panel. So I moved to Madrid 2 years ago prior to the pandemic because I loved city life and I couldn't afford to live in central London. And it was amazing to be able to live in the heart of a city. Madrid's one of the few places in Europe where the bars haven't shut and you can still go to the theatre and art galleries and museums. And I wouldn't trade that for anything else. I just can't see myself going back to London until the restrictions are kind of lifted. I've also been speaking to colleagues in Australia, and it's just interesting to see what the future might look like. So I work in the hospitality industry. Bars and restaurants have been like killed during this pandemic and demonized the world over, which makes me very angry. So Australia, while things have opened up, apparently there's not a reluctance to come back to bars on a safety level. Of Friday, Saturday night, the bars are pretty much at capacity as they're allowed to be. But Monday to Thursday, they're dead in the water because they don't have the office crowd, the full-time office staff aren't there. So that's just something to consider when London is back and open. How on earth do we get people in? I think the government really misunderstands why people go to city centres. Like, we don't go into town for a Pret sandwich, we go in there for like all this cultural stuff that we can't get in the burbs. It's also interesting speaking to some of my big companies right at the beginning of the pandemic, some of them had built new offices, and they'd already decided they were going to keep them shut for 18 months because they didn't want to turn these big open plan offices into sheltered COVID secure spaces. Instead, they were going to let the progression of remote working happen, but actually use them as more collaborative spaces, because everyone is really crying out for time to get together creatively. Like brainstorming is actually, there's a lot of work I do remotely. I'm currently in the Caribbean, it's fine, but there's also a lot that I miss out on by not being in person. And some of the things that I'm working on recently came from insights when I went to visit my client's office in Slovenia. And it's just those past, impromptu conversations that happen when you actually spend time face to face that actually create some of the biggest insights. So I guess my two questions to the panel is, how do we understand, one, does the value of city centre property need to change? Because Madrid is one of the only places in Europe I could afford, I earn a decent salary, but I can't afford to live in central London. And because Madrid is full of people that live in the centre because it is affordable, maybe that's the reason why the local government has pushed so hard to keep things open, because it's not about people coming in, people actually live there. And, I've got world-class bars on my doorstep and I want to go to them. It's not that, everyone lives, there are people that live in the burbs, but there's a sufficient population that live in the centre. So do we need to try and populate our city centres again in a way that's affordable from people that are less resistant to being in crowds? And because a lot of people that I know are just crying out for being able to sweat in public or go to a festival or do something.
Thanks.
But how do we, that's it.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. Thank you very much, Sarah. The point that we're trying to reach. Thank you. We've got Joe Hurley and then Mehdi.
I've got a couple of questions. I'm just trying to understand and work out a bit more what the relationship is between the sort of productive parts of the economy in the city. Also, I'm just trying to understand whether or not cities are becoming much more parasitical on the productive sectors of the economy. That is potentially creating quite a big, potentially class divide between people who live in the city and those who work outside of it. And then the last thing that I've just been trying to understand a bit more is there something about the use value that's created in the work that people do that also matters in terms of what cities are? So the first thing, I think my pitch, possibly a bit like the Pennsylvania example of Maria, is probably coloured by living in a place that was heavily manufacturing. Interestingly, healthcare for poor people is where I come from in Nottingham. Bikes, cheap transport was a massive big industry, and cigarettes, our leisure, was also created in the city. And I think that those things now having gone, the focus for people who live in the city, I think it's almost like they've become a service class. The poorer people the majority of people who live in the city are also in poorer paid jobs. And it makes me think that actually what's happening is that that is where I'm saying that there's a parasitical relationship on the city, that it very much depends on people coming in for retail, people coming into the city for hospitality and leisure, and then all of the other trades go on around that in terms of things like transportation. And all these people are doing really poor paid jobs, serving the rich. And that is really, really striking in a place like Nottingham, because it's very exaggerated. It's something like 90% service sector, which is just astonishing. So that then brings me on to it's not a final question, but then I'm just thinking, when you look at all of the policy documents and the planning documents around Nottingham, they talk about the digital economy, the science sector, all the rest of it, but most of it's impenetrable. I can't understand what those jobs and how they translate into anything meaningful for a lot of people. They're very abstract, and you can't understand what's underneath the bonnet of these things, or what's inside the door, or what these people are doing. And that's where it just made me think about the use value. Is there something important what people actually create in cities, that actually also gives it a vibrancy.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And then Mehdi.
Thank you, Austin. Just an observation, perhaps a personal observation, is that we've been in an intense lockdown now for more than, I would say, for more than 26 weeks. And there's much talk about people undergoing mental distress. And I'm not an expert in that. I haven't confronted myself. I haven't seen it. But what I have seen is changing of character, people's behavior in the way that they've become impatient, they've become virtually bordering rudeness, and they've actually have changed in a way that now, what is it due? Is it due to various forms of frustration, sexual frustration, lack of networking, or what we have? But nothing much is being talked about that. What is talked about the kind of the extreme side of it. But how much of these, what I call change of character or characteristics, is going to be allowed to move forward once we ease into from the lockdown, if you like, and how much people would actually try to assess themselves that there has been such a change, and they can actually perhaps revert to back to what they've been, what they used to be. And I think this is because it's very much spread in the population, and I think it's going to be much more difficult to confront.
I think that's a very useful question as well, in terms of socialization giving rise to an understanding about ethical behavior and etiquette, and that isolation that we often find, and whether Patrick can describe it as being not isolated, but actually group activity, whether there's a new foundation for different forms of etiquette to be developed, or whether the kind of the Twitterati and the insensitivity and the hostility that we find on social media is maybe something which is growing and something we need to be worried about. But anyway, look, there's a lot on the table there for the panel. So if any of you want to come back in, address some of those points or earlier points, I'm more than happy to take you now. Patrick, you obviously wanted to come back on Alistair, but there's lots of other stuff here which is on the table for you.
Right, well, yeah, I just want to first go back to Alistair. I mean, in terms of, although I agree that I'm against this kind of even pre-pandemic moralizing in favor of local living against travel, and now during the pandemic, there was a highly kind of overly moralizing charge on hounding down nearly some people. So it creates a kind of an atmosphere which kind of distorts maybe the choices one would make. But in a kind of freely evolving society or post-pandemic, I don't think we have to have prejudice about whether it's more online and digital mediated online learning. I'm not against it. I'm having quite a good positive experience now with the AA and a totally new group of students. And also there was a fantastic, productivity is the key. What's going to be most productive? And we realize that the revelation that we can be so productive in terms of, organizing major collaborative submissions, that we can explain projects to clients and negotiate contracts. And for me, it's a relief, of course, that I don't have to fly, 15 times to China per annum. And productivity, I think that's the key. What's going to be more productive? Also socially, this idea of wanting to be out and networking, we want to be productive, we want to be linked in, we want to develop our careers and be inspired. I think it's all linked in, and if that partially can be accommodated by virtual means, we shouldn't prejudice against that. And that would be my pitch here, and what we need is really the freedom to do it. So what is great in universities, they can actually, we now have all these students which sit in their various locations, and we have the sessions, and the productivity is high, the submissions are high, and the visa restrictions are not now an obstacle, political. So globalization moves on. And I think I wish we had the same, opportunities for employment. We don't. So we have these students that don't need a visa to be not coming to London, but we won't be able to hire them. And there needs to be a lot of, and the same as with all these conversions of the various spaces. So we need much more degrees of freedom to enjoy and discover what's the most productive and satisfying ways of life. And I don't have I maybe know where I'm at the moment would go, but I think Alistair is too prejudiced with respect to some kind of maybe a model where we had made new discoveries, I think, which will shift the balance, irrespective of ideological pressure. I don't want that pressure, but I think we should discover and be unprejudiced with respect to the productivity gains and where they lie. That's where our life will be pulled towards.
Okay. Can I just ask you one quick question? Are you still charging international student fees for people sitting in their bedrooms in
Well,
Shanghai?
I'm not charging, but yes, I think the AA is doing that.
Yes. It's always been a scandal, even when students had to turn up, but even worse now.
I mean, they're getting a great experience, but yeah, they're saving on the living costs in London and on the visa hassle.
And all that terrible chatting to people.
But they get more airtime from me than ever before.
This is true. I don't doubt that you're giving them their money's worth, Patrick, as we always know that. All right, the rest of the panel, you've disappeared from my screen. Anybody there want to chip in on what's been said, those questions asked?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? There's definitely no one size fits all with all of this. Some people love it, some people hate it. But just on Mehdi's point, there definitely are changing behaviors. I remember way back before COVID, I'd have my day or two working from home. They were the most productive days of the week, no disturbances. I knew exactly what I was taking home and work on it. Now, and that sort of carried on a little bit. But then I felt it dipped, and then I felt expectations changed a little bit. These back-to-back Zoom calls that people just think are acceptable now in a way that wouldn't have happened in the office. This thing of, well, just put the 3-hour meeting in your diary, and if you can't make it, don't worry, we're recording it so you can just watch it at some other point in time. Absolutely unacceptable behaviors are developing in the workplace as well. This expectation you can always be available, or you can just find 3 hours some other point in your week, or maybe just in the evening because we're having our meeting, and if you miss it, tough kind of thing. So I think the other thing is how this is affecting things like eyesight as well. How many people have told me their eyes have really declined in the last 6-8 months. There's so many negative impacts, I think, that we haven't really understood yet. Behaviors that are changing, impacts that we're experiencing, and I think all of that really needs to be understood before we commit ourselves to this online world that we're talking about. So lots to think about. The behavior thing, the character of people, changing behaviors, I think is really one to watch.
Absolutely. Well, I've spent 12 months at my dining room table, and I have deep vein thrombosis, I think. Anyway, anybody else there? Alistair, you've appeared on my screen.
I lost the 10 kilos again, so one can deal with it. One can learn.
True. I need to get more exercise. Maria is out there, and Alistair, do you want to come back on anything?
Well, yeah, to follow on from Julie, really, on Mehdi's change of character thing, because I think that's an astute observation, actually, that there has been a shift, and I suppose it's in a way reflects what seems to be a mixing up of what are in the past would have been assumed to be fairly private affairs that might have been conducted behind closed doors, but which more and more seem to be, for various different reasons. I guess social media is probably one of them, actually, in the way that we've come in almost embedded in this social media world, which gets us to expurge all our private affairs into a public domain. But in some ways, it almost seems like real life is following that trend that social media has certainly advanced, and this is almost like, I guess, a breakdown of those two separate domains. I mean, if you read any of these sort of books or novels or whatever about the way that people used to come to come into cities sort of 100, 150 years ago, then one of the things that really comes across is the extent to which people reinvented themselves in public. Their public lives were entirely separate from their private lives because they had the possibility of taking on these entirely new characters, and the kind of clothes that they wore and the way that they conducted themselves was reflective of almost this person that was completely divorced from the private. But that doesn't seem to happen in the same way. And I guess the other aspect of it is that the way that public is brought right into the household. I mean, just reading the other day about some new initiative by local authorities where they're going to really ramp up the extent to which they can control what happens in tenanted council houses. So you've got almost the man from the state is saying much more what can be done in the private domain. So it's that kind of collapse of the two things.
Very, very good. Maria, you...
Yeah, I would like to just, if I may, just respond to something in the chat. I think that
Yeah,
is that
please,
right?
please. Yeah, it's really active
No,
in the chat.
someone put in that 4 million in the UK have no access to the internet. And then I also think about, and then there's one above that talks about a virtual world that may lead to a lack of diversity and talking with people who don't think the same as us in the virtual world. So I think this probably tips to Alistair's concerns as well, as regarding this lack of social interaction. I just, maybe I just am the eternal optimist and believe in the human condition, but I really don't think one will ever outride the other. I feel like it's going to be ultimately this sort of this hybrid. I think there was, in one of the articles I was reading in preparation for this talk, it was a UK BBC host, Ezekiel Emmanuel, I think his name is. He talked about people's 3 basic needs. One is security, one is sociability, and one is the need to travel and the need to roam. And I really think that those are right on. I mean, the basic, the foundation of people just having that need to feel secure and safe, and that they're getting their food and their basic needs are being met. But sociability, we are social animals, we are social creatures, and the need to socialize, I think, has never been stronger. I think there's a need to visit family again and to get to engage, and then the need to travel. So virtually or not virtually, those things are never going to change. We're just these are our fundamental basic needs as humans. And the virtual conversation, I think, from my perspective, is just, again, it's about creating these communities of interconnectivity and pockets of opportunity in ways that didn't exist before. But I don't think in any way it's ever going to override the human condition in the long term. And serendipity, when you bump into somebody, I mean, you could bump into somebody on the sidewalk and have a conversation or make new relationships, but I don't know how you do that virtually. How that happens. And so there's some interesting things in the chat about diversity and virtual world. And then think about the people who don't, we're lucky enough to have this internet connection right here and have this conversation, but it's a whole bunch of people in the world that don't, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that point about whether placemaking, because it's one thing which runs through all of your contributions in some way, shape or form, positive or negative, but the idea whether you can make places in the way that we talk about in urban discourse, whether that's possible in a virtual world. Patrick can maybe come back on that in a moment, but I'll just take the 3 hands which are up at the moment, if that's okay, and we'll have a bit more of a conversation. Sheila, please. Are you with us, Sheila? Anytime you're ready. Okay, Sheila's disappeared.
I'm here now.
There you are. Okay.
Sorry, Austin, it was telling me that you were muting me. So my overriding sense of all of this is that all of it is temporary. So this is a temporary crisis. and we will repopulate the physical world again very soon. The way in which we do that, how quickly we'll do it, and what the impacts are, yes, that's what we're talking about. But the idea that there is a virtual world we're going to mainly exist within is something that I would reject completely. And I don't want to live in the virtual world. I want to use tech where it's great, but I don't want to live in it. And then the point about character, I do also feel that it's entirely rational to be utterly miserable at the moment about everything that's happening as a result of being locked down. So again, it's not some psychosis where we'll all go into some asylum. I think it's a rational response to not being allowed to mix socially, to go to work and everything about it. And then the third point that Austin knows I really interested in, and in the chat I was saying, we're not talking about markets. Politicians are controlling what we do. And we're talking about how culturally we think this might affect things and what ideas architects might have. But how much, and I suppose this is the main question, Austin, how much do we think that real estate interests are going to reshape what we're doing? You know, that their interests in the fact that it does seem that so much floor space is going to be redundant in every sector, whether it's retail, offices, you know, there's just huge quantities of it. And I can't think of all the new uses there might be, and certainly not overnight. It might take 5 years to, and in the meantime, somebody's got to pay the rent. So it's kind of, where's the real estate questions going on about how the city is shaped? It's about 100 questions there, Austin.
No, I think in a conversation about virtual world, that was a proper hardcore real world question. So thank you for that. We've got Joel, please.
Hi, I don't work in architecture. I work under music, arts and cultural perspective of the city, I guess. And I was thinking this time last year, I was in Yangon in Myanmar. And there's something, part of my work is at the British Council is about connecting people internationally in arts. And I think you just can't replicate the experience, you know, the smell, the sort of feel and the kind of getting under the skin of a city, and the physical sort of existence of the city is absolutely vital to people's culture, to their sense of place. And previously to that, we'd hosted a delegation of people from Vietnam, from all sorts of different arts, cultural practitioners around 4 or 5 cities in the UK over the course of a week. It was a bit of a whirlwind, but it was a really incredible experience for all of those people in terms of connecting and sort of understanding what the UK was about how different cities had a very different identity. We'd been to London, to Manchester, and Edinburgh. And yeah, I personally, really feel that the vitality is in the physical space. And I think it is, you know, as Sheila was saying, I see it as a temporary thing. I think one of the challenges with virtual spaces is that they're very mediated as well. And it's not sort of necessarily a sort of a cop-out, but I think people have really tried to navigate the virtual and digital space absolutely brilliantly over this last year. One of the things that we'd explored was, you know, could you replicate those kind of study visits online? You know, what can you do online? Next week, we're sort of doing an online lab for the first time that we'd in past years done physically, flying in people from all over the world to spend a week together, working, collaborating, you know, really sort of exchanging ideas. And it's very difficult to do that digitally. I know people are trying to be as creative as they can in digital spaces, but there are some things that you just miss the nuance. I had 3 colleagues recently who announced to me that they were going on maternity leave. I had no idea they were even pregnant because I've only seen them through this sort of square window. So I think that's just an example of you know, what you can really miss, and also the interactions with people. That said, I'm also quite optimistic about the use of tech and the use of tech creatively. I know, Austin, you mentioned you wondered whether there was a bit of a difference between the way the arts and culture sector perhaps approached technology. And I think it does offer some interesting opportunities. There's a lot of investment going into it. And I think there will be things that will stay. I think there'll be things that people will really want to continue, as well as getting back into the sort of physical world.
Thanks. I think that's the first anecdote about Immaculate Conception over the internet. So thank you for that. Lots raised there. And Nico, please.
I don't want to be a booster for digital everything, and I'm sure Alistair will come back on me on this. But I do think, to some extent, and this is picking up on Patrick's points and to an extent on Julie's points, that we really have very limited imagination about what digital networks could afford us in terms of how we live and how we collaborate and how we work together. And I'm certainly not going to boost the smart city idea, which seems to have died rather in the last year, understandably. But, you know, we're sitting here with screens, video cameras and so on, which have been around for 20 years. You know, we're limited by these very, very limited displays and input and output devices and so on. And you know, that's not the vision that the, you know, grandmothers and grandfathers of computing had. You know, people like Doug Engelbart and Vannevar Bush and Alan Kay and so on. You know, they wanted us, these tools, to be really to enhance our capabilities and to augment our intelligence and to be integrated into our environments in appropriate and humane ways. So I do think while the physical world, as Gerald's just been talking about, and Sheila and so on, is critical, I think we could do a lot better in terms of how we use digital technologies. So just want to list 4 affordances that we might consider. One is immersion. What would a wall-sized video display that you could literally kind of be in the same office as your Hadid colleagues in Beijing afford? What would peripheral vision be in the workplace or even the home, where you could get a sense out of the corner of your eye or your sixth sense that something was happening in another space? It might be something that's initiated by haptics, it might be auditory and so on. And I realize there are downsides to all these things if they're not well designed. What would the idea of something that was glanceable be, where you could just pick up a bit of information from something that really just had one function, and it might tell you if a co-worker was present, or you know, just what the weather's like outside? Just don't know. And then the last thing is haptics. You know, why have screens? Why does everything we do now, is it vertical? You know, humanity grew up largely since the advent of writing horizontally, and you know, in a space that we chose, and in a space where we could really interact with things, where things were tangible, where we had many other ways of interacting with them. And in that sense, you know, we need to break out of the screen, and we need to find and exploit those kind of possibilities. And that doesn't solve a lot of the problems that we've talked about, but I think we need to return to the imagination about the future of digital technology that the inventors of the internet and digital computing had. And I think that could make a huge difference, you know, and enhance the real world as and when we get back to it, not the new normal that Alistair doesn't want, but something like the old normal. Okay, so I'd be interested in particularly Julie and Patrick's responses to my
thank you very much,
intention.
Nico. Thank you very much. Sorry to talk over you. But it's interesting as well, the privatization of public space has been a criticism that many kind of left activists have been arguing about for 20, 30 years. The question then is as to who owns the virtual sphere would be an interesting question. With final hand up, I have Ruby Lovett.
Yeah, it's not Ruby, it's just boring old me, I'm afraid, Austin.
Okay.
So I think we've covered this quite a lot, but I mean, obviously I'm in favor of anything that enhances the human experience, but the human experience is in social interactions. And what I find with some of these discussions is almost like a social interactions are kind of transactional. So we will find relationships with our neighbours, you know, sociable people will find a way to come together. And, you know, it's a bit like that line in Jurassic Park, you know, life will find a way. But actually, there's something in the edges and the spaces in between. There are things that are uncomfortable about social interactions that are kind of part of the human experience anyway. I think Alistair touched on some of those things. But in terms of the work experience, I mean, clearly we have a generational divide where somebody in Gen Z is thinking about the practical implications, you know, the economic implications, the environmental implications. But for me, in the world of work, what is really missing from this discussion is modeling behavior. So I worry about young people not, you know, learning the skills of the trade, but not learning and modeling from older generations. So although whilst, you know, what am I, Gen X, I might feel quite comfortable to sit in my slippers at home, but I feel like there's a social duty to kind of be out there and be sociable for other people, not just as a kind of transactional thing because I need a bit of company. So I just think there's something about the edges in between this that's not quite being grasped.
I think that's an interesting question. Obviously, even prior to COVID, there's a conversation environmentally about old people ruining the future for younger generations. And then we have COVID, where young people are told that they're killing their grannies, being hazardous for the older generation. So there's always, for the last 20 years, there's been a generation war conversation, which, as you say, this then fits into and actually isolates people perhaps even more. But look, first, thank you for that. Any comeback on this? We're coming to the end of the conversation, so I'm afraid the audience participation doors are now locked. So we're coming back to the panel. And I know Julie has to be away. So can we just go back through this in the order in which people spoke? So could I just take Maria for any comments that have been raised, any answers you may have, or any final closing remarks you want to make? Maria, are you there?
I'm here. Hi. Yeah, this has been a lot to think about. Anything from pre-COVID to post-COVID to still in COVID, and I'm finding this so interesting. I've enjoyed the interaction with the chat and the reading along with all these thoughtful comments. I wish there was a way to capture those and keep them. I've enjoyed meeting Patrick, Alistair, and Juliet. Thank you so much for your thoughtfulness, and I look forward to the future. I hope I get to interact again in some manner. Maybe we revisit this conversation a year from now.
Exactly.
see what happened.
We should all meet up in reality and have a drink. Indeed, in the and I can take the chat as long, and I will edit out any odd remarks, hostile remarks, or anything too private. So don't worry about that, and I'll just give it to the panel themselves.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I've enjoyed meeting everyone.
Thank you very much, Mary. Don't go away yet. We'll give you a round of applause at the end. Right, Patrick, next up, please.
Well, first of all, Nico, you got it absolutely right. Thanks a lot for that contribution. It's very stimulating, and actually we're working on these kind of ideas, you know, because I don't think the experience is, you know, the VR headset by yourself making gestures, nor looking at a laptop, but it is being in a social space with windows, whole walls, videoing and into another virtual world with across the globe. And in between, so new headsets actually are those where you actually see through, you still can interact and overlap. AR is coming along. There's an enormous amount of investment, and I think it's wonderful. I want to also say something about public and private spaces. As you know, I think in all public spaces where we socialize in public, openly, can be privately run, organized, and it would be the better for it. And I think there is a lot of competition, good competition, and multiple choices for various types of audiences is what is healthy here. People also talk about, you know, monopolies as a threat, but I think there are network effects. What do you think about it? Netscape was overdone by Google, MSN Messenger, and these first social spaces were taken over by Facebook. Now you have things coming out like Clubhouse. I think there's enough dynamism compared with the, let's say, industrial complexes we had. There's more dynamism and new entries. TikTok versus YouTube, Snapchat, there's always something coming up. So I trust in that. And I think that there's an enormous amount of dynamism in the kind of public domain, which is the virtual domain. And what Nico said about transformative changes to the experiences will happen. And again, for me, it's a fusion in the end. So I don't think it's going to be isolated where we're sitting in suburbia. No, it's going to be embedded within the urban space as well. Think of Trafalgar Square, but everywhere. And I love the fact also horizontal surfaces, ceilings, and various ways. Google glasses were kind of, because of PC worries, were withdrawn from the market, but actually they've been always there all the way through with in the corporate sector, and now there's Facebook glasses. So I trust in technology, and we have to let technology fly. And that's another pitch for get the regulators out of the way. Let us all discover these technologies, and don't be too risk averse, please, on that.
But just very quickly come back on you. So in terms of creative destruction, or whatever it is you're describing,
Absolutely.
right? I understand that capitalism finds a way, Phoenix rising from the flames and all the rest of it. But obviously there's not a lot creatively destructive about what's happening with COVID per se, in what Sheila was asking about, which is that kind of destruction of land values, destruction of huge swathes of rentable space, which will possibly not be occupied, and rents will still have to be paid, bankruptcies will go left, right, and center. Is that just part of the process of whatever will be, or is there?
We need to allow this to happen. We should not try to save everything and then freeze up and paralyze everything. This has to happen.
Okay. There's another.
The bankruptcy is just new owners. The business continues.
There's another public discussion I can see emerging here, Patrick. Thank you very much for that. Julie, if you're still here.
Yeah, look, I'm totally with Patrick on that. You know, we are social beings, as was said before. That's not going to go away. You know, we're all going to come back and meet again and so on. But the opportunities that are coming with digitalization are just immense. And, you know, I think it's about how we embrace that and what the opportunities are. Today, there are these kind of glasses that you wear for virtual reality. Tomorrow, that experience will be very different. We're in a transitionary period. When you look at how digital technology has changed over the last 10, 20 years, it's exponential. So, you know, it might seem a bit scary or a bit alien to us all today, but these will become seamless experiences as we go forward. And let's embrace it and enjoy it and make the most of it where we can.
Fantastic. God, everyone is so optimistic. This is good. But is it truth? Is it real? Alistair, what do you think?
Then there was me. I think people are underestimating the impact of this period and the potential ramifications of it. I mean, it's true, as Maria and Julie say about we're social creatures, but the problem is that it depends how we get an outlet for that sociability. And to me, the current period is one of constraining those opportunities and trying to introduce as a kind of alternative what I think is a thoroughly unsatisfactory alternative in terms of digital and virtual worlds, which whatever Nico's hopes for the future are, and I kind of, I don't want to damn the hope for the future of something better. I mean, obviously, I hope that comes true, but the reality is that in today's world, it's not there, and sociability, I think, is being very much constrained and undermined, and all the possibilities that go with that. And I think on Patrick's point about the regulators need to get out the way, I mean, I just think that's too simplistic, Patrick. I mean, the problem is, and this is what I was trying to hint at in my introduction, is it's not just that regulation exists, it's just that we don't seem to have the human desire to exceed the boundaries of where we are just now, to push past that regulation. So the regulators have got an easy job, because in a way they're not even being challenged, and we're not even trying to take things further. A perfect example actually is the example that Sheila brought up about the real estate. I mean, there's any amount of capital kicking about just now that could be invested in interesting things, but because there's not a profitable outlet for it, then it sits in people's bank accounts or goes to share buybacks or whatever is going on in the financial world. So I think the solution and the necessity actually is that we become a bit more ambitious and a bit more experimental. And that's a human thing. It's not a kind of too much regulation. It's kind of within ourselves finding the enthusiasm and the capacity to become more experimental and risk-taking and to do new things. And I think that's where the technology angle falls down just now, because there's some very interesting new technologies all around us, but what ends have they been used to? You have driverless cars, for example, that have taken over from flying cars as the great ambition. Well, flying cars to me were about human possibilities, about being able to travel further and faster and mix more and all the rest of it. Driverless cars seem to be about shielding us away from the world, about avoiding taking the risk of actually driving somewhere ourselves and kind of enjoying that spirit of freedom. Likewise, GPS and mobile phones. I mean, one of the uses that are being put towards increasingly is to ask people to report where someone said something offensive to them, or an instance of antisocial behavior. So there's a kind of anti-community spirit of these new technologies and the uses that they're being, or certainly not the technology itself, but the uses that it's been put to. So I think socially we need to challenge some of these things in order to realize a more productive outlet and possibilities of what we could have.
Okay, there's no coming back on that, I'm afraid, Patrick. I always think that if you want to get into a vehicle and just have a voice-activated driving experience, you just get in a taxi. Anyway, that's my little joke. I also think that it is interesting that there's this discussion about cities and the possibilities, and I don't doubt one jot everything that's been put forward on the technological advancement and the ambitions and the perspective and the progressive potential behind it. But at the same time, we are living in some respects in a much more isolated and a much more fragmented and a much more risk-averse climate, and those things jar. They don't really kind of always end up in the right results. So even though I'm probably with what everybody said, notionally, I just think that there is a restriction, a climate of restraint, which may not give rise to some of those positive gains as quickly or as in the right direction as I would like it to be. But what do I know? So look, what can I say? Ladies and gentlemen, that was a fantastic conversation. As a matter of fact, it was probably about 10 conversations. I asked too much of you, but you stepped up to the plate and gave as good as you got. So thank you all very much for that. I'm going to quickly plug this again, which is from the Academy of Ideas, just one of the little polemical pamphlets. I'm writing one on the Greens, on environmentalism. This one, Maria, if you're looking, is on sovereignty. But there's a lot of them about. And then finally, I have a discussion coming up on the 18th of March with Paul Embry, discussing his book, Despised, Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class. We talk about anything and everything here. So you'd all be welcome back. Can I just quickly ask for an unmute moment to give a round of applause? If